All right. Well, howdy. We will be in the book of 1 Samuel chapter number 17. And I do want to publicly thank Brother Carey for this opportunity, as, of course, any scheduled places that I was to preach, of course, had to be canceled. So I do want to thank him for this opportunity. And when he informed me that he was wanting me to preach, I got pretty excited because the Lord has been giving me some new things, and I was looking forward to being able to preach them. And as Brother Carey said the other week in a revival, he said, a lot of times, and especially during these times, we want to preach something that's very encouraging and a shouting message. Preach on heaven or something, or victory in Jesus, or about how this world's not our home, and so on and so forth. A good shouting, make you feel good kind of message that we would like to pull out. But we are not here, and we were not called to preach Brother Matthew's words or Brother Carey's words. We were called to preach God's words. And so the Lord put this on my heart last night as I was praying about it. And I have preached this sermon before, but the Lord has gave me a new outlook on it and on this story of David. And I understand that this story is a very familiar story, and we are very familiar with what the story says. But as I have said in past times, that the Bible is the living Word of God, and we can learn new things and be spoke. New things can be spoke to us, and we can even be reminded of things that we had already learned, but had slipped our memory, and be taught new things. And the Bible can speak to us afresh and anew every time we open its pages. And so the Lord has given me a different outlook on this, and the Lord convicted me last night that during these times we have a problem with service, and we have a problem with responsibility and continuing to do our responsibilities as God's people. So the Lord laid this sermon on my heart as a sermon of service, and to encourage us to keep on serving and keep on doing our responsibilities and the things that we are to do as God's people. Instead of just focusing in on Goliath and looking at getting past obstacles and trials, we will look at Goliath some. But I want to use this message in this story of David to encourage us to keep on serving, to encourage us to keep on doing what's right and serving God wholeheartedly, regardless of what is going on in the world around us or what is happening in our lives, that we would still serve God wholeheartedly and be devoted to the service of God. So let's look here in 1 Samuel chapter number 17. We'll begin reading in verse number 1, and we'll read a few verses here, and we'll kind of look at the story as we go along. Verse number 1, 1 Samuel chapter number 17. It says, "Now the Philistines gathered together their armies to battle, and were gathered together at Shokah, which belongeth to Judah, and pitched between Shokah and Azekah and Ephes-dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together, and pitched by the valley of Elah, and set the battle in array against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on a mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side. And there was a valley between them. And there went out a champion out of the camp of the Philistines, named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. And he had an helmet of brass upon his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail. And the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of brass, and he had greaves of brass upon his legs, and a target of brass between his shoulders. And the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, and one bearing a shield went before him. And he stood and cried unto the armies of Israel, and said unto them, Why are ye come out to set your battle in array? Am not I a Philistine, and ye servants to Saul? Choose you a man for you, and let him come down to me. If he be able to fight with me and to kill me, then will we be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then shall ye be our servants and serve us. And the Philistines said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. When Saul and all Israel heard those words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now David was the son of that Ephrathite of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Jesse. And he had 8 sons, and the man went among men for an old man in the days of Saul. And the 3 eldest sons of Jesse went and followed Saul to the battle. And the names of his 3 sons that went to the battle were Eliab, the firstborn, and next to him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. And David was the youngest, and the 3 eldest followed Saul. But David went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. And the Philistine drew near morning and evening, and presented himself 40 days. And Jesse said unto David his son, Take now for thy brethren an ephah of this parched corn, and these 10 loaves, and run to the camp to thy brethren. And carry these 10 cheeses unto the captain of their 1,000, and look how thy brethren fare, and take their pledge. Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. And David rose up early in the morning and left the sheep with the keeper, and took and went as Jesse had commanded him, and he came to the trench as the host was going forth to the fight, and shouted for the battle. For Israel and the Philistines had put the battle in array, army against army. And David left his carriage in the hand of the keeper of the carriage, and ran into the army, and came and saluted his brethren. And as he talked with them, behold, there came up the champion of the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, out of the armies of the Philistines, and spake according to the same words. And David heard them. We will stop the reading there. Now, number one, I want to look at an earlier part of David's life before this battle and before his father had asked him to bring these provisions to his brothers and to their captain. And number one, we find David's tasks. David's task. And first of all, we find that David had a daily task. Now let me say this first. Let me say that we as God's people, we as Christians are all given general tasks. General things that apply to every child of God, to every Christian, things that everyone is supposed to do. Responsibilities and tasks that everyone has, such as tithing, giving our tithes and offerings. We are to do that faithfully, of course, and we can still do that even in these days. And of course, witnessing, being a witness, proclaiming the Word of God is not something that is just for preachers or teachers or missionaries or evangelists or pastors to do. That is something that applies to every man. That is something that applies to every newborn, every child of God. And that is a general responsibility, a general task. We are, of course, supposed to all read our Bibles. We are to all pray. And so there's things that we are all supposed to do. But also God gets specific. He gives different ones specific tasks, personal tasks, things that only certain people are supposed to do. God calls certain people to preach, and of course, as God has called me to preach and others, as we know, and that is a responsibility, that is a personal responsibility. And He has given others different gifts, different talents and abilities that they can use to serve God. Not everyone is to be a singer or to be a musician or to be a teacher or a preacher or a missionary or an evangelist. And I know we use these different examples as things of personal responsibilities and personal tasks, but whatever your task or your gift or your talent may be, or whatever God has given you to do, we are to do that. So we find that David had a daily task. Right here we can learn a great lesson of obedience as we find that David was watching over and taking care of his father's sheep. So we find that David's daily task was a shepherd. He knew that every single morning he woke up, that he had at least one thing that he had to do. Regardless of what was going to happen that day, regardless of the other tasks or the other things his father may have asked him to do, regardless of how the day was, I'm sure there was definitely days that were real easy, calm, cool, easy going. He may have had a shade tree to sit underneath. I'm sure there were times where there was plenty of green grass for the sheep to graze on, and plenty of cool flowing water for the sheep to drink from. And then again, I'm sure there were days that were tough, that were hot. They may have dealt with some famine or some drought and had different problems. But regardless of what was going on that day, David knew that he was still a shepherd. And it was still his responsibility to take care of his father's sheep. Whether there was a lion or a bear to come in the way, he still knew that that was his task, regardless of what was to happen. And we find the same thing with we as God's people and the specific and the personal tasks that God has given us to do. For example, me as a preacher and others, every single morning we wake up, we are still preachers. There are still things and responsibilities we have as preachers that we must do. We must study. We must learn these things and talk with God. And as I said, we are all supposed to pray and read our Bibles. But we must study and seek what God has for us to say and seek what God would have for us to preach. And so every single morning I wake up, I know I have at least one responsibility and at least one thing that I'm going to do as I am a preacher. And others as musicians, every single day you wake up, and a musician that is serving God and doing his part in the house of God must always be practiced and be ready. Know the songs, know the lyrics to the songs for singers, know the chords to the songs and different things. And so we as God's people, we have daily tasks, things that we are going to do every single day, regardless of what's happening, regardless of what stands in the way, regardless of what the reality of our world is. We still have these daily tasks, these individual personal tasks. And let me say this, not everyone does have the same responsibility. We are all given different responsibilities, and different people have to do different things in the church for the church to operate correctly. So we find that David had a daily task. But then second here, we find that David was devoted to any task. We find in these scriptures that David was incredibly committed to whatever his task was. We find that he was so committed to taking care of his father's sheep. We find that he was so devoted to this seemingly small and simple thing of being a shepherd that he was willing to kill a lion and a bear if that's what it was going to take to keep his father's sheep safe. Now, I don't know about you, but if I was watching over my father's sheep and I was a shepherd and a lion or a bear came out, I would just have to go tell him that a lion or a bear had ate one of his sheep, because I can promise you, aside from our modern day firearms and weapons, I would not go down there to kill a bear or a lion with my bare hands. But not David. We find that he was so devoted to what his father asked him to do, and so devoted to his daily tasks, that he was willing to do anything to keep that job done 100%. And this lesson can be learned by anyone, about doing anything in any area of service, in any way we serve God, that we should be 100% devoted to these things. And it's an incredible thought when we look at David, and David as a picture of Christ. And we find that throughout Christ's ministry, that he was all the time just about his Father's business. Whatever his Father wanted him to do, that's what he was going to do. He said, I must be about my Father's business. When he prayed in the garden, he said, Father, not my will, but thy will. And we find that David seems to have that same thing in mind. Whatever his father asked him to do, that's what David was going to do. And he was going to do it 100% wholeheartedly and be completely devoted to whatever he was asked to do. And whatever his heavenly Father or his earthly father had for him, he was completely willing to do. And we must have that same mindset, and especially in these days, as I have said, and the Lord has convicted me, that we slack off on our service and our responsibilities and the things that we do, as we are no longer physically coming to the house of God during these times, when we're not physically interacting with God's people or the preacher. But thankfully, through modern day technology, we can still hear God's Word, and we can still hear the preaching and hear the singing, and God can still speak to us in that. And we still must be willing to serve God even in these times. And hopefully we do not have to get used to this. Hopefully this is a temporary thing. But whatever God's will be, we should be 100% devoted to whatever God would have us to do. So we find that David had a daily task. We find that David was devoted to any task. And then we find that David was given a divine task. Let's look at verse number 24. It says, And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him, and were sore afraid. And the men of Israel said, Have you seen this man that has come up? Surely to defy Israel is he come up. And it shall be that the man who killeth him, the king will enrich him with great riches, and will give him his daughter, and make his father's house free in Israel. And David spake to the men that stood by him, saying, What shall be done to the man that killeth this Philistine, and taketh away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God? And the people answered him after this manner, saying, So shall it be done to the man that killeth him. And Eliab his eldest brother heard when he spake unto the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David. And he said, Why camest thou down hither? And with whom hast thou left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know thy pride and the naughtiness of thine heart. For thou art come down that thou mightest see the battle, And David said, What have I now done? Is there not a cause? And he turned from him toward another, and spake after the same manner. And the people answered him again after the former manner. And when the words were heard which David spake, they rehearsed them before Saul, and he sent for him. We will stop the reading there. So we find that David was given a divine task. We find that because David was so devoted to his daily task, and so devoted to doing that seemingly small and simple thing, that God was able to give him some divine things to do. And let me tell you something, if we are willing to be devoted to our task and our responsibilities, to our general responsibilities and our personal responsibilities, if we are willing to be 100% devoted, regardless of how seemingly small that task is, or the simplicity of that responsibility, or the greatness of that task and the incredibility of that task. And so we find that David was given a divine task. And we find that this here is leading up to David, of course, to slay Goliath. So God was able to give him this divine task. So we find that David had a daily task. We find that David was devoted to any task, and he was given a divine task. And number 2, we find David's trust. David's trust. Let's look at verse number 32. Verse number 32. It says, And David said to Saul, Let no man's heart fail because of him. Thy servant will go and fight with this Philistine. And Saul said to David, Thou art not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for thou art but a youth, and he a man of war from his youth. And David said unto Saul, Thy servant kept his father's sheep, and there came a lion and a bear, and took a lamb out of the flock. And I went out after him, and smote him, and delivered it out of his mouth. And when he arose against me, I caught him by his beard, and smote him, and slew him. Thy servant slew both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them, seeing he hath defied the armies of the living God. David said, Moreover, the Lord that delivered me out of the paw of the lion, and out of the paw of the bear, he will deliver me out of the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said unto David, Go, and the Lord be with thee. So we find David's trust. We find that David's trust and faith and his confidence in God in this situation was unmatched and truly incredible. Can you imagine the amount of courage it took for David, this youth, as this passage says, this young man, this lad, is willing to stand before the king of Israel. And when every other military man and man of war and every other soldier, all these seemingly great and mighty people are hiding in a trench, David is willing to say, I will go and fight this Philistine. I will go and slay this Philistine just as I slew this lion and slew this bear. And as I just read, let me make mention of this. As I just read, well, we find that David's brother said to him that he came down and he knows the naughtiness of David's heart, and he was doubting David for what he had came down there to do. But David was just obeying his father. David was just doing what he was supposed to do. And let me tell you, there's going to be plenty of people and plenty of times where people are going to doubt what you are doing. But we find that we are just going to have to trust God as David did. Not worry about the others, not worry about the people that doubt what we are doing, but still just stay committed to what our Father is telling us to do. So we find David's trust in this situation. And can you imagine the amount of courage it took for David to stand before Goliath and say what he said? To say to Goliath, after Goliath had said to David, I'm going to feed your flesh to the beasts of the field and to the birds of the air. And for David to say, no, I'm going to feed your flesh to the beasts of the field and to the birds of the air. We find that David's confidence and David's courage was incredible. Because as David said to Goliath, he said, I don't come before you with swords and with spears and with these, but I have come before you in the name of the Lord. So let me say this, regardless of what we are doing, regardless of what it is God is telling us to do or calling us to do, we are to just to trust God and understand that God is the omnipotent one and God is the all-knowing one. And He is the one that knows what He is doing, not us. We are not to lean on our own understanding. And we find that we are to have faith in God with whatever He is having us to do. We know that without faith it is impossible to please God. For example, as me surrendering to preach, I remember I was just an 8-year-old boy, and I was laying down there in my Nana's living room. It was after a Sunday night or a Wednesday night because we had just came home from church. But as I was laying there, and I undoubtedly felt the call to preach on my life, and I felt the Lord telling me to do that, and I thought to myself, well, this is crazy. I was like, Lord, why would you want me to do this? I'm just an 8-year-old boy. And I thought that I was entirely incapable and entirely unworthy to do this thing. But I just had to trust God and know that He was the all-knowing one. He is the one that knew what He is doing and not me. So I just went with it. And I can promise you, I could never imagine, if you'd have told me in that moment what I would have done in the next 6 and 7 years, and the different places I would get to go, and the different opportunities I would get to have, to even get to go to other countries and travel to so many different other states. And I'm not bragging on myself, I'm bragging on God for giving me these opportunities. I promise you, I would have thought you was crazy. But we find that we were just willing to trust God and willing to be devoted to the task that He gives us, that He can do some divine things with us. So we find David's trust. Number 3, we find the most important part of this story. We find David's triumph. David's triumph. Let's look at verse number 38. Verse number 38. It says, and Saul armed David with his armor, and he put an helmet of brass upon his head. Also he armed him with a coat of mail. And David girded his sword upon his armor, and he essayed to go, for he had not proved it. And David said unto Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not proved them. And David put them off him. And he took his staff in his hand, and chose him 5 smooth stones out of the brook, and put them in a shepherd's bag which he had, even in a scrip. And his sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. And the Philistine came on and drew near unto David, and the man that bare the shield went before him. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, and ruddy, and of a fair countenance. And the Philistine said unto David, Am I a dog, that thou comest to me with staves? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, Come to me, and I will give thy flesh unto the fowls of the air, and to the beasts of the field. Then said David to the Philistine, Thou comest to me with a sword, and with a spear, and with a shield. But I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defied. This day will the Lord deliver thee into mine hand, and I will smite thee, and take thine head from thee. And I will give the carcasses of the host of the Philistines this day unto the fowls of the air, and unto the wild beasts of the field, or of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. And all this assembly shall know that the Lord saveth not with sword and with spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and He will give you into our hands. And it came to pass, when the Philistine arose and came and drew nigh to meet David, that David hasted and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag, and took thence a stone, and slang it, and smote the Philistine in his forehead, that the stone sunk into his forehead, and he fell upon his face to the earth. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and smote the Philistine and slew him. But there was no sword in the hand of David. Therefore David ran and stood upon the Philistine, and took his sword and drew it out of the sheath thereof, and slew him and cut off his head therewith. And the Philistines saw their champion was dead, they fled. And the men of Israel and of Judah arose and shouted, and pursued the Philistine until thou come to the valley and to the gates of Ekron. And the wounded of the Philistines fell down by the way of Shaaraim, even unto Gath and unto Ekron. And the children of Israel returned from chasing after the Philistines, and they spoiled their tents. So we find in this part of the story David's triumph. And as I said earlier, I don't want to linger here for too long and focus in on Goliath, but I do want to use this as an example, and especially during these times, we find that David was willing to do this task, regardless of how fearful and how scary and how great this task was, and how seemingly difficult of a thing it was to do. But as I said, David still had complete confidence and complete faith and complete trust in God. That God, just as He had delivered him from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, that God could deliver him out of the hand of this Philistine. And as I said, David went before him in the name of the Lord of hosts, not with swords and with spears and with shields. I want to make mention of this real quick. We find that when Saul tried to put his armor on David, that David said, I cannot go with these, for I have not proved them. David was not trained to use this armor, to use these weapons, to use swords or shields or a bow and arrow or a spear. These different things. He was not trained to do that. He was not a man of war. And we find that no doubt this armor was probably way too big, way too heavy, as we find that Saul was a very tall man, as we find that he was head and shoulders over all the men in Israel. And so this armor most certainly wouldn't fit. But it would make sense for David, if he was going to go and fight this Philistine, that he would need these things. He would need armor. He would need the best of the best weapons and the most advanced things of that day for him to go and kill this Philistine. But we find that David did not use that. We find that David used a sling. David used what God had him to use. And I remember when my mother, it was back several years ago, during a vacation Bible school one time, she had the lesson one night, and her lesson was on David and Goliath. And she began to make an example of how you could imagine that David, as he was watching over the sheep daily, as I made mention of. And we could imagine that maybe one day for his birthday or something, his father may have bought him a sling. And that David could have thought, well, my goodness, what on earth would I need a sling for? You know, why would I need a sling? Of all the things you could get me, why would you get me a sling? And we find that you could imagine that David being close to the Lord like he was, that David may have felt the Lord telling him to go and practice his sling. Or maybe his father may have come outside every once in a while and came to him and said, David, why don't you go practice your sling? And we could imagine that David always thought to himself, now why on earth would I need to practice my sling? Why on earth would I need to be able to use a sling? David probably never knowing what God would have him to do. And the same thing can be in our lives. There may be things in our lives and different gifts and abilities that God has given us, and things that He has given us that we are capable of doing that may make no sense to us. Like, why would I ever need to be able to do this thing, or to do that thing, or be able to use this, or be able to do that? Why would I need to be good at this, or be good at that? And we may never know what God has planned for us in our future if we are willing to be devoted to these things. We find that David just simply used what God would have him to use. We find that it was not an uncommon thing in this day for someone to use a sling. We find in the book of Judges, chapter number 20, verse 16, it says, among all this people, there were 700 chosen men left-handed. Every one could sling stones at an hairbreadth and not miss. So we find that during this day, this was not an uncommon thing to use, but it also wasn't a very common thing to use, you would think, to go and slay a giant. But that is what God wanted David to use. He did not want David to use a sword and a shield. David had not practiced with a bow and arrow throughout his childhood, or a sword, or a shield, or this armor, or different things. He practiced with a sling. And we find too many people today trying to use a sword when God just simply wants them to use a sling. We find too many people trying to do somebody else's task, and too many people being jealous of what other people is doing, or jealous of the gifts that God has given other people. And for example, Brother Shay, me and Brother Shay, which were the closest of friends, And Brother Shea comes in and tells me all the time about how him at school, how he's got to witness and speak with these different atheists, these different denominations, these homosexuals, these different things, and these opportunities that he gets to speak and teach with those people. And oftentimes, I'm not necessarily jealous, but I think, man, I wish I could get to do some of these things. And I wish I could interact with these people and talk with these people. And then oftentimes, Brother Shea, in talking to me, and the things that I get to do, and the area of service, and the things that God allows me to do, such as travel and sing and play and preach and do these different things. And Brother Shea says sometimes, man, I wish I could do those things. And of course, I get opportunities to witness to people, and Shea gets opportunities to travel, but that is not what God has for him to do, and that is not what God has for me to do. Brother Shea is to do what he is doing, and I'm to do what I'm doing, and neither one of us are to be jealous of what the other is doing. I'm not to try and go and do what Brother Shea is doing, and Brother Shea is not to try and go and do what I'm doing. And as I said, too many people are trying to use a sword or do something that might be impressive or something that would make sense, something that seems great, but that is not what God has for them to do. But as I said, if we are willing to be devoted to these simple tasks that God's given us, whether it seems what you're doing is very insignificant and seemingly unnecessary and unpurposeful, and still be devoted to it, then God can be able to use us to do some divine things. We find that David just simply did what God wanted him to do and used what God wanted him to use. And so we are simply to be faithful to God in the littlest of tasks, in the simplest of tasks, and God can allow us to accomplish some great tasks. Now, I want to finish by saying this. I want to talk about David's trophies real quickly. And we can imagine that David had some great earthly trophies to look at. We could imagine that he could have kept Goliath's head maybe and had that skull displayed in his palace, or the skull of the bear or the skull of the lion on display there. And we can imagine he had some great things to talk about on this earth. We find that he won many other great battles. But can you imagine the treasures and the riches and the trophies that David had in heaven? Now, I know that David was still a sinner. He was still adulterous. He was a liar. He was a murderer. He did all these terrible things. But I want to focus in on what David did good. He wasn't perfect, but he did a lot of good. And let me tell you, as I said, this world is not our home. We are just a passing through. And God has told us that if we are willing to serve Him, if we are willing to be devoted, and we are willing to do our tasks and our responsibilities, that there is treasures to be gained. There are rewards and riches to be laid up in heaven. So I just want to close with this. If you will stay faithful, regardless of what it is God is asking you to do, and in the great task and in the small task, if we are willing to be 100% devoted and trust God in these things, we can lay up eternal rewards in heaven. Amen.